This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
A few critics practically see my project as self-contradictory. If my premise is that the economic consensus is reliable, how can I reach a conclusion that the economic consensus rejects? As Christopher Hayes colorfully puts it, the book eats its own tail. Caplan wants to grant a presumptive authority to the consensus view of economists, but the consensus view of economists is that voters are rational, which is, of course, precisely the position he wants to convince us is wrong. This complaint would be airtight if my premise were that the economic consensus is infallible, but my actual premise is merely that economists, like other experts, deserve the benefit of the doubt, and that the burden of proof rests on those who question the expert consensus. Since the rational voter assumption is part of that consensus, my responsibility as a naysayer is to refute it, which is precisely why I needed to write the book. The most serious criticism of my work is also the strangest. A number of critics, such as Daniel Cass in the Wall Street Journal, deny that popular misconceptions actually influence policy. Nowhere in The Myth of the Rational Voter does Mr. Caplan demonstrate that dumb voter bias triggers bad public policy. Take free trade. Mr. Caplan reports that support for free trade hit bottom in 1977 when only 18% of Americans favored eliminating tariffs. Yet 3 years later, Ronald Reagan campaigned on a platform of free trade and proceeded to sign historic free trade agreements with Canada and laid the groundwork for free trade with Mexico. Cass concludes that voter bias has fueled some foolish national debate in recent years, but imposed very little foolish national policy. In effect, he defends democracy by saying that the voice of the people falls on deaf ears. The Myth of the Rational Voter explicitly states that democracy's policies are better than you would expect, given public opinion. But this does not imply that public opinion is unimportant. If voter bias has no effect on policy, why were extensive protectionist measures adopted in the first place? Why does protectionism remain after 3 decades of liberalization? The most convincing explanation is also the simplest. Politicians backed the original measures to win votes. Their successors remain reluctant to liberalize because they are afraid they will lose votes. Cass may be right that in recent years, voter bias has imposed few new foolish policies, though the Iraq War is a strong counterexample, but this is misleading in 2 ways. First, very little new national economic policy of any kind has been imposed in recent years because gridlock keeps the status quo in place. Second, and more importantly, Cass focuses on how policies have changed instead of what policies exist. A democracy should not be judged a success merely because it refrains from making bad policies worse, or makes a half-hearted effort to correct long-standing mistakes. After all the friendly media coverage, a big question left in my mind is whether the book will actually change academic research. Mental inertia and conformity pressure inside the ivory tower are strong. Even professors who agree that voters are irrational may pursue intellectual dead ends because it is easier than starting over. Still, I am optimistic. Behavioral economics has never been stronger. It has become almost impossible to do applied economics without learning some empirical psychology. Behavioral political economy should not be far behind. With some luck, the conflict between what economists believe as researchers and what they believe as teachers will culminate in serious cognitive dissonance and scientific progress. Once economists admit to themselves that voters are just like their students, only worse, they will be poised to unravel the mysteries of politics and policy. If and when economists come to their senses, social scientists from other disciplines, especially political science, will hopefully give us a hand up. Complaints about economists' arrogance are often off target. Considering how little attention most economists pay to empirical political science, though, I have to admit that there is some truth to the accusation. Economists' disinterest in public opinion is especially egregious. How can we build models about conflicts between the public and special interests, for example, without even peeking at the vast literature about what human beings actually think and want. Fortunately, political scientists are unlikely to